The relationship between the African diaspora and literature has long been one of complexity.
But not anymore. Welcome to the Literature Lounge. On the continent of Africa, oral and written literature have a long-standing history within various cultures and regions. Although we will not be able to deduce this matter down to simple evolution in this episode, we will try to gather a basic understanding of how various cultures on the continent of Africa has influenced modern literature. Modern African literature was born in the educational system imposed by colonialism, with models drawn from Europe rather than existing African traditions. But the African oral traditions exerted their own influence on these literatures. Imagine, you're sitting huddled together with your brethren, and the storyteller is giving an account of the history and lineage of your people. As you close your eyes, you imagine in vivid detail every word, and in that moment, you realize you were in the presence of history. For the African diaspora, our sacred stories of heroes and triumphs, along with the historical accounts of our people, have not always been rooted in written works or written literature. Pre-colonialism, educating future generations was more than just academics written in a textbook, but it was the ability to allow the audience's memory to serve as a vessel of remembering and reliving a distant and obscure past. The storyteller uses the manipulation of their body and voice to affect the present state of the audience. The stories of our ancestors dealt with mystic change, one of the cosmos, celestial beings, historic transformations, and the acts of culture. It is the metaphorical relationship between the memories of the past and the known images of the world of the present that constitutes the essence of storytelling. The oral tradition of literature is forever in transition. It's never hardened in time. It's always responding to contemporary reality in a timeless fashion. Storytelling is therefore not a memorized art. Oral history on the continent of Africa can usually be broken down into 6 genres: the riddle, the lyric, the proverb, the tale, heroic poetry, and the epic. Oral and written storytelling traditions have had a parallel development, and in many ways, they have influenced each other. Ancient Egyptian scribes, early Hausa and Swahili copyists and memorists were crucial transitional figures in the movement from oral to literary traditions. Because the origin of oral and written literature is so vast across the continent of Africa, we will explore how oral tradition has been adapted into written literature by region and culture throughout the continent. For instance, in the Yoruba tribe, there's a story of oral tradition about a boy who moves farther and farther away from home. With the assistance of a fox-like character, the boy is able to meet challenges set by the Oba in 3 kingdoms. The fox becomes the storyteller's means of revealing the developing wisdom of the boy. This oral tale is the framework for the best-known work in Yoruba and the most significant contribution of the Yoruba language to fiction, which contains fantasy and realistic images along with religious didacticism. This novel very effectively combines the literary and oral forces at work among the Yoruba artists of the time. There are two competing strands in Yoruba literature, one influenced by the rich Yoruba oral tradition, and the other receiving its impetus from the West. The history of Yoruba's literature moves between these forces. Moving to the east coast of the continent, Ethiopian literatures are composed in several languages: Ge'ez, Amharic, Tigrinya, Tigray, Oromo, and Harari. Most of the literature in Ethiopia has been in Ge'ez and Amharic. The classical language is Ge'ez, but over time, Ge'ez literature became the domain of a small portion of the population. The more common spoken language, Amharic, became widespread when it was used for political and religious purposes to reach a larger part of the population. Ge'ez was the literary language in Ethiopia from a very early period. The Kibra Nagast, or Glory of the Kings, written from 1314 to 1312, relates the birth of Menelik, the son of Solomon, and Makata, queen of Sheba, who became the king of Ethiopia. The work became a crucial part of the literature and culture of Ethiopia. Royal chronicles were written, and there was some secular poetry. But most of the writing was religious in nature and in tone. The first novel written in Amharic was an imagined story written by Afaworq Gabra Iyesus. The oral storytelling tradition is clearly in evidence in this novel, in which a girl disguised as a boy becomes the center of complex love involvements, the climax of which includes the conversion of a love-smitten king to Christianity. Central themes in post-World War II Amharic literature are the relationship between humans and God, the difficulties of life, and the importance of humility and acceptance. Swahili literature is usually divided into classical and contemporary periods and genres. There were early historical works, such as the Pate Chronicle, reassembled by the 19th century scholar Fumo Omar al-Nabhani. It describes events from the 13th to the 19th century, both religious and secular poetry, showing the influence of Muslim Arabic literature and of the East African culture from which it arose, was a central vehicle of the written literary expression. It was Shaban Robert who had the most dynamic and long-lasting effect on contemporary Swahili literature. He wrote poetry, prose, and proverbs. Some of the early contemporary writers on the continent sharpened their writing abilities by translating works into African languages. The Arabic, English, French, and Portuguese literary traditions, along with Christianity and Islam, and other effects of colonialism in Africa, also had a dynamic impact on African literature. But African writers adapted those alien traditions and made them their own by placing them into these African classical frames. The Onitsha market literature of Nigeria, the popular fiction of Accra, Ghana, the love and detective literature of Nairobi, and the complex comic strips sold in the shops in Cape Town. There was a clear interaction between the deeply rooted oral tradition and the developing literary traditions of the 20th century. This can be seen in the impact of the epic and the novel, for instance. Writers such as Tutola had a dynamic effect on the developing literary tradition. Such works went beyond mere imitation and transcription of oral storytelling. Gaibon Senzo explored the relationship between oral tradition and writing in his popular Xhosa novels. He was able to establish a new connection between oral tradition, the writers of popular fiction, and those writers who wish to create a more serious form of literature. Modern African writers today owe much to African oral tradition and to those authors who have occupied the space between the two traditions in an area of creative interaction.